Everything from clothing to household items are getting more expensive each day. The world of fast fashion has complicated clothing production by shipping cheap parts around the world to whoever can sew them the cheapest. And now you, the consumer, are paying the price with rising costs. American Giant is about keeping things simple and close to home. They aren't affected by tariffs because their products never leave the U.S. Skip the tariff and snag yourself American-made clothing with American Giant. Get 20% off your first order when you use promo code STAPLE20 at american-giant.com. That's 20% off when you use code STAPLE20 at american-giant.com.
Hey, warm up from the low. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peters, and now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got a great podcast for you. We're going to be joined in a few minutes by Riley Frain. He does such great work over at both Mid-Major Madness, and he does an amazing job over at the Portal Report. We're going to be chatting with him about some of these first-year head coaches that might be able to get the ball rolling. Some of the teams out there in the northeast part of the country, since that's where he resides, that he feels like might be able to have some upward momentum. Teams that he's expecting quite a bit from this season, and a few teams that are a little bit under the radar. There are sleepers that he's liking for this upcoming season. So nice little bit of a wide-ranging, broad chat with him coming up here today, as we got ourselves a lot of two-part conversations happening in the next few months on this podcast, because the transfer portal, it is very much winding down, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about with Riley as well. The fact that it does feel like we've got set in stone a lot of these rosters, and now we're able to project forward for the upcoming season. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you, for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, name does not matter, so per usual, please send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions, everything is presented by Edge Boost. Edge Boost is the first ever bank account built for bettors. They make sure that 100% of gambling related transactions all get approved. You get cashback rewards as you use Edge Boost. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, type in that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That gives you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. Now let's chat with our good friend Riley. He does such an amazing job gauging this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. You're able to find him on Twitter/X at his first and last name, Riley Frain. That last name is spelled F-R-A-I-N. And Riley, it is great to get you aboard. Thank you so much.
Right, yeah, of course, Greg. Thank you so much for having me, man. It's always a pleasure to dive on here with you, talk a little bit of college basketball. It's certainly not the busiest time of year, but, lots of deep college basketball stuff going on. So always a pleasure to get on here and chat with you a little.
And it's great to have you aboard, because I know that you do such great work over at the Portal Report. But as we know with the Portal Report, does the portal ever end? Truly no, but I don't know if you feel the same way, but it feels like now we finally know these rosters, and maybe there will be like a depth piece that's added here or there, but I feel like things shouldn't be changing too much until the start of the season, unless we see like a surprise firing or two, which we typically do see like one or two, but past that, I feel like things are very much haze in the barn, and we can get set for the upcoming season.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Greg. It feels like at this point everything's pretty much set. But you're certainly, to your other point, you're not wrong. It feels like the portal never really ends. I mean, even the other day we just got a specific ruling that certain guys who meet a specific requirement could enter the portal this late into the offseason and potentially look for somewhere to play this next season. And even so, there's a couple guys left over in the portal who were sort of maybe trickled to some potential Division I programs, maybe a little lower down the totem pole. But for the most part, definitely sort of quiet to this point. A lot of teams are sort of set in their rosters and in their ways, and I'm excited to see how some of the best transfers, highest ranked transfers in the country sort of perform at their next destinations this upcoming season.
Yep, no question about it. I do think that it's going to be a lot of fun there, and obviously you do some great work over there on the northeast part of the country, and I know you do a great job over at the Portal Report, but are there a few teams out there in your neck of the woods where you feel like they've done a good job of maintaining their talent and they could really take some strides forward with some of the returning pieces from a season ago?
One of the teams that stands out to me, really local to me, is St. John's, and I think that's a bit of a head scratcher. You say, they lost the Big East Player of the Year in R.J. Luis. They lose a guy like Simeon Wiltshire to the portal. They lose another exciting prospect in Brady Dunlap to the portal. I think the big piece that they're able to keep was Zuby Ejiofor. Tino and his staff are able to go out and bring in a couple exciting guys from the portal to build on a handful of freshmen that they're bringing in as well. When you're able to maintain such a focal point like Zuby Ejiofor, who was, such an integral part of their Big East run at the end of the year, and you're able to build off from him, I know it's one piece compared to sort of retaining your whole entire roster. When you have sort of, one or two guys to build off of a small core like that, who was so important to sort of, your success in past seasons, I think it only helps to sort of integrate the transfer class into sort of what you're doing within your program and, get the team going right away. So I look at St. John's being able to keep a guy like Zuby Ejiofor, what they'll be able to do there with his success. Maybe another team in the A10, even like a St. Joe's a little bit further down, and who over the past couple seasons have done a really great job retaining some talent. I know, obviously they're losing, Eric Reynolds and Bashir Fleming, who are both departing for pro careers, and Xavier Brown hit the transfer portal. But just to my point, being able to retain talent and being able to build and have a core, I think St. Joe's is a good example of this. Potentially it gives you an opportunity to continue to build a program. And then when you look to go into the transfer portal, you don't have to be consistently building a roster of 10 to 12 guys every offseason. You can be picky and choosy about what you want to bring in, the types of talents and guys you want to bring in. It just helps you to sort of build a program, build a culture. And I think a program like being able to keep a guy back to St. John's, a guy like Zuby Ejiofor is huge for a program like that as they look to continue to build under, I know Patino heading into his third year, but still, a fairly new staff to the program.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that with St. John's, it's going to be such an interesting team with Slick Rick Pitino, obviously one of the best coaches out there in all of college basketball. And I think that their outlook for the Big East is so solid, mainly because they do a nice job not only of being able to pair the guys that they have coming back, but I felt like they did a nice job this offseason of addressing their weakness of the fact that this wasn't necessarily a great three-point shooting team. I feel like they did a great job of being able to just make sure that that is not going to be happening this upcoming season, that they're going to be a little bit more dangerous from the outside.
Yeah, I think Patino or somebody on their staff maybe joked about it with the media the other day that their shooting was going to be vastly improved this year. But you look up and down at some of the acquisitions they were able to make this offseason. Ian Jackson coming over from North Carolina, a guy who shot it at almost 40%. Jason Sanan, another freshman coming from a power conference program in Arizona State, who shot it at 37% from three. Isaiah Sellers from Stanford, who was an outstanding three-point shooter there, and even a guy sort of like Dylan Darling coming over from Idaho State, a bit of a wild card. I'm interested to see sort of how his game translates to high major basketball coming from a program like Idaho State. But if his game translates, that's a really a guy who can bring a ton of scoring and offensive playmaking to a team like St. John's. So to your point, Greg, I think they did a really good job addressing some of their weaknesses. Obviously, the three-point shooting was one of the big things from last year. But bringing in a couple of exciting names, I think, as much as they're bringing in some three-point shooting, I think, they're bringing in a little bit of versatility and size at different positions. Obviously, Bryce Hopkins is, 6'7" and could play on the wings. He could even be a ball handler if needed. And they're doing a little bit of everything in terms of what they needed to address in the transfer portal this offseason. And just being able to keep a guy like Zuby Ejiofor and what they added around him, I think it's, a recipe for them to compete again in conference next season.
Yep, I think that is going to be so big. And Zuby Ejiofor, I think that he's going to be one of the best big men in all of college basketball. And I do think that is an interesting place to look as well, because I look at these teams that brought in big men, and I'm feeling relatively bullish about them. Like Michigan bringing in Yaxel Lendeborg, his 6'9" overall versatility. I think that is going to be absolutely massive for them. Obviously, with Purdue bringing in Oscar Clough, I thought that was big. And I think in this day and age, the big men might be a little bit, shall we say, less valuable than it was perhaps 5 to 10 years ago. But I do feel like a lot of the best teams in all of college basketball, they still have one thing in common: some very, very good post play.
Yeah, it doesn't always have to be the focal point of your offense. A couple of guys you mentioned there, Oscar Clough, I really love at Purdue. I think will be, the focal points of their offense. But just having someone who can bring some size and physicality in the middle, and I don't want to say versatility, but just, a guy who brings a presence on the interior, can bring a little bit of offense, a little bit of two-way play on the defensive end. And just when we look at the transfer portal, size is so coveted nowadays. It's even at the high major ranks. When you look at the guards and wings, typically, these high major programs are bringing in, it's sort of guys who were averaging double-digit points at lower stops, or who were maybe once high major recruits and, are sort of ready to take that, step back up to the high major ranks. But when you look at the big men position, it feels like, 6'9", a 6'10" guy who can really compete at the high major level, bring a lot of size, a lot of scoring, a lot of versatility. It just, you don't see a ton of them out there. So just how coveted size has become in the transfer portal nowadays, it really is so interesting to me. And the few teams that can bring in some of those guys, they really tend to shoot up our rankings at the portal report. You mentioned Michigan with Axel Lemberg. I know they're very high up in our rankings this offseason as well, just because he was one of the top transfers in the portal, this offseason overall, Lendenberg. The programs that, can bring in those few, big men who really are some of the star players across the country is a huge success in the transfer portal, especially in this day and age of college basketball. If you can put some pieces around a guy like that, I think it sort of projects well for your program heading into the season. Absolutely.
Oh, no question. And I do think that it's going to be a lot of fun to take a look at those programs. As joining me on the show, we've got Riley Frain. He does such great work over at Mid-Major Madness along with the Portal Report. Joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And Riley, I know that we talked quite a bit about these mid-major programs, and there are quite a few that you're feeling bullish upon. But when it comes to the mid-major ranks, who are a few coaching hires that you take a look at that might be able to just really elevate a program? Because I look at Fordham, and they're going to be dealing with some sanctions. They're going to be dealing with some roughness. But I really felt like Mike Magpio was a really good hire for them. Obviously, out there in the Atlantic 10 as well, VCU, and how they were able to bridge things together with bringing in a guy who has no shortage of experience in Phil Martelli Jr. I think that that's going to be rock solid as well. And with Riley being in the northeast part of the country, I think that this is a good jumping off point for part number one. And then in part number two, we'll talk a little bit about some of these mid-majors out there in the northeast part of the country that did a good job of being able to hire on some new coaches, some of the expectations that come for some of these first and second year head coaches, and then a few teams that he thinks are a little bit of a mystery coming into the upcoming season. That's up next, right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, J.D. Peterson, now a part of the Peterson Family Podcast.
Everything from clothing to household items are getting more expensive each day. The world of fast fashion has complicated clothing production by shipping cheap parts around the world to whoever can sew them the cheapest. And now you, the consumer, are paying the price with rising costs. American Giant is about keeping things simple and close to home. They aren't affected by tariffs because their products never leave the U.S. Skip the tariff and snag yourself American-made clothing with American Giant. Get 20% off your first order when you use promo code STAPLE20 at American-Giant.com. That's 20% off when you use code STAPLE20 at American-Giant.com.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Gibbs Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Great to be rejoined by Riley Frain. He does great work over at the Portal Report. Coupled with that mid-major madness, you're able to follow my Twitter/X at his first and last name, Riley Frain, with that last name spelled F-R-A-I-N. And let's tap into a little bit of what you do for mid-major madness, as I do feel like there are quite a few teams out there in the northeast part of the country at the mid-major ranks that needed coaches. And overall, I thought that there were some good hires. They did a very good job of just being able to evaluate things and really being able to just keep that, if their program was in good standing, to be able to keep that moniker, / if a program needed a little bit of a reset like Fordham. I thought that it was a really good hire with Magpio.
I'll start with VCU. I love the addition of Martelli Jr., obviously, sort of in that A-10 mold. Obviously, his father was a legendary coach at St. Joe's. Martelli Jr. himself found a lot of success for a Bryant program that's been solid the past couple years, has really grown into itself as a Division I program since transitioning up a level. Martelli was able to sort of keep that stature going, and he takes them to the NCAA tournament last year with a conference championship, and he gets the job at VCU, and I think they went out and killed it in the portal. He surrounded himself with a really good staff, some really good assistants who are great recruiters, great coaches overall, and able to bring in some really talented guys. They were able to bring in sort of a mix of guys from high major and some really talented mid-major guys, and I think we had them ranked third in the A-10 in terms of their overall transfer class ranking. So really like what they were able to do this offseason. I think that's a VCU team that's always really top 3, top 4 in the A-10. They're always really competitive in conference. And, I think under Martelli Jr. and sort of his staff and what they were able to do this offseason, that'll continue. I look down conference rankings at Fordham, but I don't necessarily think they'll be a bottom feeder this year with Magpio, who I was lucky enough to get invited to his opening press conference for. And just a really analytical-based head coach, but I love some of the guys they were able to bring in the transfer portal this offseason. And I don't know if we've touched on them enough in some of my appearances on the show this offseason. Mike Magpio, I think they were able able to bring in Zariq Nutter as sort of the marquee transfer addition that I think is going to carry that program forward next year. A really good offensive talent coming in from Georgia State. On top of that, his analytical style, it leads to maybe, they didn't bring in the most like big name marquee transfers, but the talents that they are able to bring in, not necessarily guys who are jumping off the board, but I think guys who are going to be really competitive for a team like Fordham, who are going to play with a lot of fight and tenacity. I mentioned Zariq Nutter, but they're bringing in DeJour Reeves from Iona, who was a really competitive scorer there, and I think is going to be a solid talent in the A-10. They're bringing in Christian Henry over from Eastern Michigan, who was a double-digit point guy there, and I think could be a solid player for a team like Fordham. Even I looked down the roster at some of the guys they were able to bring in, and I just love the overall class talent that they were able to bring in. I think it's a really exciting roster. And maybe I'll just round it out, sort of looking out of the A-10 briefly at one of the teams who hired a new coach this offseason in Campbell, and sort of in that Mike Magpayo Columbia tree. Campbell hired John Anderjak this offseason, who spent time playing at Columbia, then worked there as a student manager and briefly as an assistant coach, and was obviously an assistant coach with the Florida team that won the national championship this past offseason. He gets the job this past season, and he gets the job at Campbell this season, and they just killed it in the portal. I mean, I think they're one of our highest ranked mid-majors in terms of their overall transfer class that's coming in. They fall inside of our top 20 at the portal report. And just bringing in some talented guys who I think are really exciting for a level like the CAA. Someone like Amiri Stewart coming over from Sacred Heart, Quinton Mincy coming over from UMass Lowell, who was a really talented scorer there. Someone like Jeremiah Johnson coming over from Green Bay. I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with Greg, but overall, I think that's a Campbell team that's going to take a step up in the CAA this year under a new head coach and John Anderjak, and another analytical guy similar to Mike Magpayo, like I mentioned in that Columbia Kyle Smith sort of coaching tree. And overall, a team that I think under a new head coach could be interesting to watch in the CAA next season.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned it with Mike Magpayo. You didn't necessarily bring in names that are going to be jumping off the page, but it just feels like really good fits in general. And that leads me to this. With regards to some of these coaches out there that you evaluate, are there a few guys that, even if they're not necessarily bringing in the world's biggest names, even if they're not bringing in these guys who are averaging like 15 plus points per game at their previous job, you just have faith that they're going to be able to get it right. And you just have faith that even if the names aren't overly impressive, that they're going to be able to crank out a good season and they're going to get the most out of the guys that they bring in.
Sure. I mean, I'll stick to the A-10, definitely with what I've become the most familiar with. And I think a guy who's sort of grown onto that list in the past couple of years as he's taken on the role has been Tony Skinn over at George Mason. I just think a really solid head coach who I know is maybe starting to get some high major coaching interest just over this last offseason. But not only has he done a good job in the portal, but I think he's done a good job of being able to retain a couple interesting guys. He's done a good job in terms of recruiting high school talent. But this year, they were dominant in terms of the portal and what they were able to bringing in guys like Dola Adebayo from Mount St. Mary's, who I think could be really solid in the A-10, but, brings over some tournament experience from this past season. Bringing over a guy like Jeremiah Hill from Ball State, who was a really competitive scorer there. Another guy like Nick Ellington from Murray State, or even Masai Troutman from Northeastern. So, some really solid names on that list. I know just overall, we think of George Mason, we think of them as a competitive team in the A-10, but I feel like just under Tony Skinn in the past 2 or 3 seasons, they've really started to take a step forward. Another team I think that comes to mind, I'm sort of thinking within maybe the American Athletic Conference here. It's a bit of an easy cop-out, but I mean, Memphis every year under Penny Hardaway, and they don't necessarily always recruit the transfer portal. I know this year they sort of had to go in heavy, but it seems like they always bring in 1 or 2 exciting prospects. Recently, it was sort of PJ Haggerty taking a step down from the high major ranks and becoming one of the top scorers in the nations. But just the past couple seasons, it seems like Penny Hardaway always gets 1 or 2 guys in who sort of become his next success story and are able to keep Memphis competitive, in the American Athletic Conference. And I know they may always fall just a little bit short of expectations, this Memphis team, whether it be, making a deep run in the NCAA tournament or in the actual conference, falling short of sort of winning a championship. But, I think that consistency speaks to how successful they are of a mid-major program in a conference like the American. And this year they had to go out and be active in the transfer portal, and I like a lot of the names they were able to bring in, and I think it'll certainly help them to stay competitive.
Yep, I think so as well, and I do think that you're so right on with having some faith in what I consider to be the right place, to say the least, and I do think that they're going to be in for a tremendous season. As Riley Frain, he does such great work over at the Portal Report. He's joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and certainly there are a lot of intriguing teams that are out there, and I want to get your thoughts on this. Is there perhaps a team or two where you just are intrigued to see them. It's not necessarily that you're bullish on them. It's not necessarily that you're bearish on them. You just don't know how it's going to look, and you might need to see a few games before you can really make a sort of determination as to how good or bad the season is going to be for them.
Looking a little bit more at the high major ranks, maybe stepping a little bit out of my speciality, I was writing up sort of our rankings on the Big East transfer classes the other day, and I'm really just interested to see how things play out for Seton Hall after a really down year. I think they have a pretty good coach, and I like what they've been able to do prior to this past year, under Shaheen Holloway, and I'm interested to see sort of how their transfer class plays out. I'm a huge fan of Bud Clark coming down from Merrimack. I think he's one of the best undersized guards in the nation. A lot of time undersized guards sort of struggle to transition to the high major ranks, and Merrimack to the Big East certainly seems like a big jump. But, I think he's a guy who could make that jump, and I'm really excited to see how he handles it. I look at another guy like Elijah Fisher from Pacific, who, had his chance in the high major ranks with Texas Tech, was a really highly recruited prospect, and, never quite worked out. And he takes a step down to Pacific, and he becomes a really strong offensive guard, maybe not the best, or a really strong offensive wing, maybe not the best three-point shooter, but, a guy who I think his offensive game, he's gotten a little bit older, he's gotten a little bit smarter, and I think maybe his game plays a little bit better at the high major ranks now. And on top of that, they're bringing in a couple guys from the high major level who are sort of struggled for minutes, maybe struggled to find their footings at past programs, and with Seton Hall sort of on a down step right now, coming out of last season. You look for guys like that, they move to Seton Hall, get a couple more minutes, and maybe they become consistent performers at this levels. Maybe a guy like AJ Stanton coming from Miami, or Mike Williams from LSU, or even someone a little bit older like a Pat Sumernick from Oklahoma State, who's going to bring a little bit of size in the front court. So there's a little bit of variety to this transfer class in terms of, some former mid-major stars who I think could be really good at this level, some former high major guys who, are I think could be really successful, given some more minutes. To your question, Greg, I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out for Seton Hall. If they put together a competitive starting five who's bringing consistent contributions, obviously they're going to be pretty competitive in the Big East. And after finishing 2-18 in conference last year, I think it was, they can only go up from here. So I do like a lot of the transfer additions they were able to bring in. I think they're not bringing a ton of freshmen this year in terms of their freshman class. I think maybe one guy at most. So tough to build a program like that. But, I think this transfer class will sort of help Seton Hall take a step back in the right direction.
Yep, I think so as well. I do think that Seton Hall is going to be able to look a little bit better this year. Now, I would have liked to see them add a little bit more three-point shooting, because that was rough for them last year, and I didn't feel like that was addressed enough. But Shaheen Holloway in his style is never necessarily one that is having his teams bomb a bunch of threes or anything like that. They're playing tough, tenacious defense. They're winning the battles on the glass, so we shall see how they're going to be able to do this season. And a man that wins a whole bunch of battles out there with regards to this great content in terms of looking at this great game of college basketball, that would be you, Riley. I know you're doing great work over at the Portal Report. You're doing an amazing job as well over at Mid-Major Madness, so let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
That was quite the outro, Greg. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Yeah, of course. I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much for the time. It's always a pleasure to get on here. Those who aren't familiar with me at this point, you can check out my work at Riley Frain on Twitter, RILEYFRAIN. A bunch of sort of mid-major focused, transfer portal focused college basketball coverage throughout the offseason. Of course, with a lot of stuff going on throughout the season. A handful of articles, videos, whatever sort of content related stuff over the next couple of weeks over on my page there. So you can come check me out. Yeah, just again, Greg, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, my man.
And it is always great to be able to get Riley aboard to talk about this great game of college basketball. So big thanks, Riley, for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN family podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, LRCM, maybe does not matter, so per usual, please just send these into the timeline. Other ways, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I'm with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you so much.